modern history, there have been great this or that debates. Kirk versus Picard, boxers or briefs, plants versus zombies. Today I will be comparing DC to Marvel, and by the end I will convince you that DC is the overall superior of the big two. Let's begin with the transition that comics made in the 1980s. It was DC was the company who took creative risks and spearheaded the change from the Bronze Age of comics, 1970 to 85, to the modern age of comics, 1985 and on, with their edgier, more gripping stories in the Dark Age of comics, as it was called. The big two had always been equal. Marvel was changing up its distribution style, and this was affecting the industry as a whole to make more profit. DC was admittedly doing worse than Marvel financially, but they had a plan. Holy Economic History of the American Comic Books Industry Batman, a thesis by Adam Schlesinger, Wesleyan University, class of 2010, states that acting on direction from then-new editor Jeanette Kahn, DC began churning out titles in what was marketed as the DC Explosion in 1976. This turned out to be a misstep. An overabundance of titles had led to several being canceled, and there was no real new revenue even into 1978, and it sarcastically became known as the DC Implosion. Kahn corrected course, though, and did not lose faith. She shifted the focus from quantity to quality. Kahn would enlist Alan Moore, who would go on to write one of DC's most iconic books, The Watchmen. This was one of their first comics to usher in this new modern age. The big two were competing for years in print, so it makes sense that eventually it would spill over into television. DC was the first to find success on television with Batman 66. The 60s were an era of uncertainty for DC, and they were looking for ways, again, to financially stay afloat, so they turned to television. They were reaching past newsstands into the American household. The popularity of the show, which ran for 3 seasons, saw an increase in readership as well, and would go on to inspire artists and comic book writers, even into current day. Marvel also found success with The Incredible Hulk in 1977, which ran for 5 seasons, but arguably, DC is the one who paved the way to their success with Batman 66. One place DC is continually outpacing Marvel is in animated content. Starting in 1992 with Batman the Animated Series, DC began setting a very high standard for animation. This trend would continue into the current day with DC's animated label continually adapting beloved stories into very well-received animated series and movies. DC's animations influence would resonate with young people and still, to this day, are cited as influencing current-day artists and writers, much in the way that Batman 66 did. Speaking of campy schlock that's actually quite charming after the fact, in a world of cinema, DC has certainly had almost as many missteps as milestones. The Schumacher-helmed Batman and Robin of the late 90s nearly killed DC's cinematic credibility. According to Box Office Mojo, it had a production budget of $125 million, but only earned $107 million domestically. Poor performance, plus bad reviews, stagnated DC cinematically until the Nolan Batman movies revived them in 2005, 8 years later. But by this time, Marvel was already experiencing great success with Spider-Man in 2002. And as DC was wrapping up the Nolan trilogy, Marvel was still ahead of them conceptually by developing a shared cinematic universe for all of their properties. This is arguably a race that DC is still losing today. However, credit must go to DC for the first successful live-action film, Superman 78. According to ScreenRant.com, an article from August 2nd, 2016, states that adjusted for inflation, the film earned the equivalent of approximately $1.1 billion. The article also lists Superman 78 as number 3 in the top-grossing DC films of all time. Marvel would not see success like this until 20 years later with Blade in 1998. In review, it was DC who spearheaded the change from the Bronze Age of comics to the modern age of comics with their more gripping stories in the mid-80s. DC was the first to find success on television with Batman 66, and they still find unparalleled success with animation beginning in the 90s and continuing through today. And while they may stumble when it comes to cinematic achievements, it was DC who first found a massive victory in cinema simply by proving themselves when they said, "You'll believe a man can fly."